Now we will continue our lecture, and we will go to different temple plans. And I just want also to remind you about the question that I asked. So what do we have in the ancient Near East and Israel? Do we have more similarities, or do we have more differences between the understanding of the temples and worship in ancient Near East and Israel? And how can we explain those similarities, and how can we explain those differences? And maybe the differences, it is easier to explain differences than to explain similarities. Usually, liberal scholars assume that Israelites just borrowed some of the ideas from the ancient Near East. So that is why we have a lot of similarities. But of course, we as conservative scholars, we cannot agree with such approach. So in this case, how can we explain so many differences that we can find between the ancient Near East system of worship and Israelite system of worship? And now let us go to this topic about different temple plans. And what we will see that there was a kind of a pattern that was used by people when we speak about temple plans. And first of all, what I would like to emphasize, and it is really true in many cases, that usually people very much honored those sacred places, and they didn't want to introduce changes, especially in religious matters. So usually they were very conservative about any changes in religion. And for example, if there was a temple and the temple was ruined, they tried to build the same temple on the same place. They don't want to change the place of the temple, and they didn't want to change very much the architecture or everything else of the temple. But anyway, we can find some traces, or not some, but some significant changes in the architecture of temples and in any other issues. Okay, and now we will discuss different temple plans. And we have, like, for example, 4 different temple plans. So we already discussed one plan, that it was a tripartite temple. But in addition to that, and it looks like this tripartite temple was one of the earliest temple plans. But later on, we can see that there were different temple plans, and one of them is a long room temple. Another one is a broad room temple. One more temple plan is bent axis temple. And one more that is not here, but I will discuss it later on, is a temple in Antis. And we will just discuss all of those temple plans so that you can understand what it is. So in the second millennium, the tripartite temple plan gave way to different types of architecture. One of the innovations was the so-called broad room temple plan. In the broad room plan, the cella is the platform where the image or an idol was installed, so it was an elevated platform. So the cella was placed along the long wall. In the long room type of temple or shrine, the cult object stood much further away from the entrance, rendering it less visible to the public. Whereas in the broad room type, it was close to the doorway and could be viewed by more of the onlookers or participants in the rituals. And Zeev Herzog argues that such innovation reflected the trends in house building. The broad room temple was very popular in Babylon, and the long room temple were spread in Assyria. And now let us look at different temple plans. So this is the broad room temple from Megiddo. And of course, it is not an Israelite temple, it's a Canaanite temple. And it is a kind of a reconstruction of the temple. So you can see here the entrance. And here you can see the cella, or this elevated platform where the deity stood. And of course, because the image of the deity was very close to the entrance, it means that people, even you don't need even to enter the temple to see the deity. So you can just, of course, not the deity, but the image of the deity. Even the people who were passing by, they can look inside and they can see the deity, the image of the deity. And this is the difference between broad room and long room temple plans. And this is the long room temple, and you can see that the cella, or the platform for the deity, is far away from the entrance. And in this case, it is how to say, it is visibility of the deity or image of the deity is restricted in this case. But here you can see that deity is more visible. And of course, as we already discussed ancient people understood temples as houses, the houses for deity. And most probably what we can assume that they just borrowed the plan that they use for the houses, just to build a house for a deity. And some scholars try to explain the difference between the long room plans and broad room plans. And let us go back. So here it is said that broad room temple was very popular in Babylon, or in the southern part of Mesopotamia, and the long room temples were spread in Assyria. And some scholars try to explain the difference between these plans by the climatic situation, by the climate in those areas. So do you see what is the difference between a long room and a broad room? Just imagine that it is not a temple, but it is just a house. In which area the broad room is broad room temple, not temple, but house plan is more, how to say, not attractive, but convenient. What do you think?
Maybe in hotter climates.
Why? Okay, good. Why?
Because all parts of the room are closer to the entrance compared to the long room.
Good. And fresh air can enter, for example.
Yes.
Oops, sorry. For example, if we have like several rooms in this house, so fresh air can enter in every part easily,
Mm-hmm.
But what if we have this type of temple, this type of, not temple, house? So what is the advantages, or for what climate this plan has more advantages?
Cold climates.
Well, yes, correct. Cold climate. Why?
Warmth.
For example, in this case, the bedroom, you can put somewhere here, far away from the entrance, so that the cold weather or cold wind or cold air can somehow you can be remoted from the cold air. So this is one of the explanation of these differences between broad room and long room plans. And thank you very much for your response. So in this case, what we can see that most probably, of course, it is just a suggestion or assumption. We cannot prove it, but it might be that people built a house for a deity according to the plan of the house that they have for themselves. And because of that, they built different plans for the temples as well. Okay, so this is broad room and long room temple plans. But there was another one, and another one is called bent axis plan. Bent axis plan. So what does it mean, bent axis plan? So in this case, in order to see the image of the deity, you need to make a turn. So you can enter here, and after that you can a 90 degrees turn, make a 90 degrees turn to the left to come and see the deity. So for example, this is a city wall temple at El Tel. So a person, but it is a very a good illustration of what the temple, bent axis temple was. Okay, and of course there is a question. So why did they make it like a bent axis plan? So another innovation is the so-called bent axis temple plan. In this case, the entrance to the temple was done in a long wall, and the altar or cult image was placed along the short wall. So a person had to make a 90-degree turn after entering the temple to approach the altar. Such a plan makes a cella or this platform on altar less visible. One of the reasons for the introduction of such type of architecture probably was to hide the image of a deity. An interesting idea regarding the function of the bent axis shrines was suggested by Manfred Bittek. He assumed that the difference in architecture might be stipulated by the gender of a deity to whom the temple is dedicated. Thus, the broad room temples accommodated the male deities, and the bent axis temples accommodated the female deities. Although such an idea might be very attractive, there is not enough evidence to make such a conclusion. Yeah, but the question is, so why did they make a plan like this, bent axis plan? So when we speak about the bent axis plan, it means that the deity is not visible. And when we compare here, so in the broad room temple, the deity is very visible. In the long room temple, the deity visible, but not so much visible. But in the bent axis plan, the deity, so the person who is passing by cannot see a deity. So the deity is hidden. And in this case, why do we need to hide the deity? So what is the purpose of hiding a deity? And as I already mentioned, we have another, I wouldn't say innovation, but it's also, we can say that it is an innovation, the double temple. One of the ancient Mesopotamian kings who is credited for innovation in the religious sphere was Shamshi-Adad I. Some scholars believe that he reconstructed the temple of Assur in Assur and changed it to a double temple where two deities were worshipped in the same complex. The remains of the foundation of the temple revealed two worship sites. One place was constructed as a broad room temple, which was a key feature of the Babylonian temples, and another was done according to the bent axis temple plan. So one of the explanation could be that it is like for two deities, one is female, another is male. But some scholars say that maybe he wanted to introduce a new type of worship. So he wanted to introduce the Babylonian worship. That is why he combined the temple of his own area with the temple to the god whom he brought from Babylon. Scholars assume that Shamshi-Adad might introduce to Assur the worship of the southern Mesopotamian god Enlil and combined worship of two deities in the same temple, the traditional worship of Assur and a new one of Enlil. However, this innovation didn't last long, and after the king's death, the worship of Enlil was eliminated. So this is like an innovation that people made up in the temple. But what we can see that those double temples were quite popular in some places. For example, this is a plan of the double temple in Emar, and we can see that one temple was done for Baal, and another temple was done for his female counterpart, or how to say, consort or spouse, Astarte. So we can see that there is one temple and another temple, and they are built very close to each other. So this is another example of the double temple. Okay, any questions? Any question about those architecture plans?
Mine is, perhaps you can remind us about the structure of the tripartite.
Okay. Yeah. Here. It's also a kind of a long room temple, because it is just a long room where the deity was. And we also have some like additional rooms. And now it's very difficult to understand the function of those rooms, but maybe these were just some storage rooms or some other places where some utensils or some other stuff was kept. We don't know exactly. And yeah, and we don't know also, but if the temple functioned not only as a place of worship, but if it had some other functionalities, administration functionalities, or some other issues were involved. So in these cases, the existence of those rooms was quite clear. So it could be just like a healing place, and people might come for healing or whatever.
Thank you.
Okay, so now if you don't have questions, so let us go to another temple plan, and it is called Temples in Antis, or Temple in Antis. Bent axis temples were substituted in many places by the temples in Antis. The temple in Antis was a kind of a long room temple with a centrally aligned entrance, and the cult focus, the place where the altar or statue of a deity stood, the analog of the most holy place, and a porch or a vestibule, a structure that preceded the temple itself, in Latin antire, and that is why we have this name Temple in Antis. So if you want to simplify the name or the function, we can say that it was a temple with a vestibule. Temple with a vestibule. Therefore, the presence of a vestibule is a key feature of the temple in Antis. However, the broad room and square room temples were also discovered, but they were in minority. So we can see that there was a kind of an evolution of the temple plans. So in the beginning, we have tripartite temple. After that, we have this long room and broad room temples. After that, we have another structure, bent axis temple. And finally, we have temples in Antis. And it looks like later on, temples in Antis substituted all other types of temples, and they were in majority. Yes, Pastor, maybe.
Yes, Prof.
Yes.
If I'm getting you, these are the development in the sequence, or these are nearly developing at the same time?
All right, very good question. Very good question. So as you can read on this slide, it's very difficult to say that it was it was a kind of a chronological development. But on the other hand, we can find like temples of different plans of this in the same time. And it can be explained why, because people, as I said, were very much reluctant to change. And the changes in the religious sphere took place, but they were not so rapid as in other spheres. So that is why, as I said, yes, we can say that temples in Antis subsequently substituted all other plans of temples. But it is not like absolutely, because we can find temples in Antis, contemporary structures with the broad room or long room temples. Yeah, broadly speaking or roughly speaking, we can say that this is a chronological sequence, but of course it didn't place in all places. So this is the plan of the temple in Antis. So we have a porch or a vestibule, and we have this one chamber, and we have the place where usually here in this niche the statue of the deity was. And I immediately want to ask you a question. So what does it remind you?
It reminds us of the tabernacle.
Yeah. It reminds the tabernacle or Solomon temple. Because especially in Solomon temple, because in Solomon temple we also have a porch or a vestibule. And we have one chamber or one department, and we have Holy of Holies there, and we have a court outside. So it really very much reminds the temple in Jerusalem. Temple in Jerusalem. The first temples of this type emerged in central Syria and northern Levant around middle of the 3rd millennium BC. And many of the temples had very massive walls, which suggest that the buildings were very high, or probably had a second store. One of the common details that were found in many temples in Andes is the presence of the cooking ware, pots, jars, etc., that suggest a kind of festal activity that involved the preparation and consumption of food. However, there were no hearths or taboons found inside the temples, which means that the cooking activity took place in the courtyard of the temple. And it's also very simple, very similar to the Temple of Solomon or tabernacle, because also they were supposed to do some cooking there. Even the priests were supposed to cook meat of the sacrificial animals if it was a sin offering. But of course it was not done inside, but it was done outside, most probably in the court of the tabernacle or in the court of the temple. Okay, so these are the temples in Antis. And of course, when we see those first temples in Antis that appeared quite long time ago, it is very understandable why some scholars say that the Israelites just borrowed this idea from some ancient Near East religions that surrounded Israel. Okay, so let us go further. The most important conclusion that it is possible to do is that most probably not everyone was allowed inside the temple. And yeah, I just want to suggest my own explanation for why we have this like an evolution of temples from one type to another. And this is related to the ideas of ziggurats. The most important conclusion that is possible to do is that most probably not everyone was allowed inside the temple, but only the temple personnel. The common people could just worship in the courtyard without entering the temple. It looks like there was a tendency to hide the deity or symbol representing the deity from the common people. It could be already traced in the bent axis temples, and the temples in Andes made the deity almost non-accessible to the common audience. It reminds the sanctuary on the top of the ziggurats, where also common people were not allowed. The shrine at the top of the ziggurat was understood as a chamber for the deity. It is possible to assume that the same ideology was behind the building of the temple in Andes. Since the construction of the massive ziggurats was very much effort-consuming and maybe not affordable for small countries and nations, the temple in Andes might be a substitution for them. So the idea that I would like to suggest is very simple, and it is like following that. Of course, so this idea of a sanctuary as a place where deity dwells, it was common among many ancient Near East religions. And ziggurats, or such kind of temples, were very much expensive, and not everybody was able to afford this one. But in this case, they tried to build a temple that, of course, by the way, every time when they build the temple, they try to build a temple on an elevated place. Even if it is a city where the temple is built, so they try to find highest point of the city to build the temple there. And so it also reminded about this, like a ziggurat. So the temple should be on the top of the hill. And of course, they tried to do it in such a way that the same philosophy was behind. So the temple, at least the most holy place of the temple, is a special chamber for a deity to live. So the deity must live in this chamber, and that is why they want to hide it, so that people cannot just disturb the deity and didn't intervene in his rest. But in this case, inevitably, one more question. We can ask one more question. And this question is about the purpose of the deity. So if the deity, I mean the image of the deity, is hidden, so what was the purpose of making the idol if people cannot see it? Or what do you think, at what occasions people might see the image of a deity? Excuse me?
Maybe rituals.
Okay, what kind of rituals? Yeah, just
they had some fertility rituals sometimes.
So what did they do during these rituals? How do you understand the rituals, and how were they performed? Okay, let me help you. For example, they have a festival dedicated to a deity, and people would like to participate, of course, in this festival. And it is done for the people and, of course, for the deity as well. Yeah, but what happened during those festivals? So usually the priests of the temple took the image and brought it out of the temple and made like a processions or something like that. And in this case, people were able to see the image of a deity. Yeah, and we can find many such kind of rituals or such kind of celebrations described in many documents, especially in Babylon, when they took, for example, there was a boat, sacred boat, and they were carrying this boat along the streets of the city, and people can also worship it. Yeah, but this could be an idea behind. So they understood the temples as the place where deity dwells. But here, when we speak about this issue that a deity was dwelling in the temple, of course, we have some other, we need to make some other reservations, because do you see, it's very difficult to say that people, most probably what we might have here is the a difference between the official theology and people's religion. And it happens very often, for example, in the Catholic Church and some other churches, when the official religion, it looks like it's more or less correct, but people's religion, people's understanding is different. Okay, now let us, we just spoke about the general issues about the temple, but now let's try to go inside the temple, and let's try to see what was going on inside the temple. And now we will speak about the deities. They usually have an image of a deity in the temple. And we can also speak about the decorations of the temple. What kind of decorations? I just want to suggest, let us make just a 10 minutes break, and we will continue. Okay?
Okay, that's fine.
Okay.
And now we are going inside the temple. And as I already said, inside the temple, we have, first of all, we have an image of a deity. So let us discuss a bit how they understood the deity, the image of the deity. Yeah, and for example, as Michael Handley says, almost every ancient Near temple must have an image of a deity. The cult image represented the deity's presence. Usually it stood on the elevated platform or cella in the inner chamber of the temple, and most often in the dark. It is very difficult to determine how people perceive the relationship between the image and the deity. In some cases, the image was understood as the body of the deity. And what is also interesting, in many cases, they don't only made an image of a deity, but they also cared about the image of a deity as if it were a living person. For example, they washed the image, bathed the image, they clothed it, they feed image. So they cared about the image in the same way as if it were a person. However, we have to be very careful when we speak about image as a deity, because in most of the cases they made a difference between the image and a deity. Jacobson, Thorkild Jacobson is one of the most famous guru in terms of ancient Near East religion. So he observed that in Mesopotamia, the god is, and at the same time is not, the cult statue. So it's very difficult to see the difference, the boundaries between the image and the deity. So that is why he said like this, that the god is, and at the same time is not, the cult statue. So in most of the cases, of course, they understood the image of a deity almost equal to God. But of course, they also saw the difference between the two. Such an attitude is seen in the customs of taking care of a statue that was common in many nations. The statue of the deity was fed, clothed, washed, etc. It is interesting that in Egypt and Mesopotamia, a special dedication ceremony for the statue was conducted, which was called the open mouth ritual. The open mouth ritual. It was understood that without performing such a ceremony, the statue could not be alive, but was just a lifeless image. So they performed this special ritual, open mouth ceremony, open mouth ritual, so that to make the statue alive, so that it would be really a live statue. And the same is true about the temples. Also, the temples were considered to be the deities' dwelling places. It doesn't mean that the people understood it literally. The Mesopotamians conceived of the temple as a metaphorical, not a literal, divine residence. Even when statues of the gods were present in temples to be clothed, fed, and bathed by the temple personnel, the gods were not understood to be really dwelling, eating, and bathing. Rather, the statues were symbols of the gods' presence there. Everyone, or at least most people, knew that the deity's real dwelling was in heaven. Okay? So what do you think about that? Are you here?
Yes, Prof.
Yes.
Yeah, I think that's something which somehow we can actually identify with in Africa. Yes, where a lot of people do this misrepresentation in something like, is it transubstantiation in the Catholic Church and all of that, where people can interpret that that statue is actually the god, when really for the people who are there, it's just a representation of the gods. It's a fine line to tread through, but yeah, I think it makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that there was a difference between like an official understanding and like a folk religion.
Yes.
Because maybe officially they understood, and they must understand this. Even do you remember in the book of Isaiah, how Isaiah is mocking at those idol makers?
Yes.
Yeah, so he says, okay, so you take a foot of a tree, of a wood, and you make a carving image of it, and the rest you use to cook food, and you worship this piece of wood.
Yes.
Even in Midrash, and there was a very famous story about Abraham. I don't know, do you know this story or not? So Midrash usually tries to fill gaps in the biblical narrative. For example, if something is not said in the Bible, they try to provide some information or something additional. And you remember most probably that in, excuse me, in the book of Joshua, chapter 24, Joshua says that your fathers were idol worshippers. And he refers to Terah and the family of Terah. And it is true, when we read in the book of Genesis, we can see that Terah and the descendants of Terah, except Abraham and Lot, all of them were idol worshippers. Even Rachel stole some family idols from his father's house. And the rabbis made up a story about that. And the story is about Abraham, and he was still in Ur. And actually at that time already, Abraham didn't worship the idols of his father, but he worshiped the true God. And according to the story, the father of Abraham, Terah, was not just an idol worshiper, but he was a person who sold, most probably did the idols and sold them to others to be worshipped. And one day, father of Abraham had some business in the city, and he left Abraham as to be in charge of his shop or his store where the idols were established or were presented for selling. And when he came back, he saw that so what Abraham did, he just smashed all the idols into pieces, and all of them were broken. So when father came back and saw the idols broken, he asked Abraham, "What did you do?" And Abraham responded and said, "Okay, so do you see, my father, one lady came and brought some like food for gods as an offering. And the food was so tasty, so delicious. So everybody of them wanted to eat this food, and they started fighting with each other. And they like smashed each other or killed each other. And father of Abraham, Terah, said to his son, okay, so, but my son, we understand that these are just images. They cannot fight with each other. And Abraham rebuked his father and said, okay, father, if you know that they are just images and they are idols, like lifeless idols, so why do you produce them, and why do you sell them, and why do you worship them? And this story is just an illustration of that the people usually understood that, in fact, those idols, they're lifeless, and there is nothing really like supernatural in them. But anyway, as I said, this religion most probably was very much, how to say, there was a difference between the popular religion and the official religion, or official understanding. So theoretically, people distinguished between the deity and its statue, in a sense that the deity was understood as much more than the craved image. Mm-hmm. However, as Handley pointed out, practically, people tended to identify the statue deity symbiosis as their god and treat it accordingly with care and petitions. So theoretically they understood, but practically they also understood that the image is a deity, and they were afraid of this image and they worshipped this image. Okay, so now I believe it's enough about the deities, about understanding of the deities. Or if you have any questions.
But Prof,
yes, please.
There, I wanted to say something before we went to even for break, because is it Huntley who's saying that there was in the temples there was an image of the god, but when if you Walton, there is an indication that at least on the ziggurats, the sanctuary there would have not really had an image per se, but then it would have, let's say, a bed for the deity, but not image itself. So I thought that would be a very interesting variation from the other temples, if it's actually true.
Okay, so yeah, it's a very interesting idea. The only issue that I'm not sure, yeah, maybe it was just like a chamber for the deity to rest, to sleep, and that's all. The only thing that I'm not very sure about is that, as I said yesterday, so none of those chambers or those sanctuaries at the top of the ziggurats were preserved until now. And it's very difficult to understand what was going inside. So everything that we know just from the description of those sanctuaries. And we can get some information from other, not direct sources, but some like mentioning of something or not mentioning of something. That is why we can get this information about that. But it could be very true, as Walton said, that this chamber or this sanctuary at the top of the ziggurats was just not for keeping the image of a deity, because most probably the image of the deity they kept in the sanctuary or in the temple that was at the base of the ziggurats. And they can just, in case of need, they can take the image of the deity outside and they can just show it to the people. But the chamber on the top of the ziggurat was just for the deity, not for the people. Yeah, thank you for this comment. Thank you for this comment. Yeah. And anything else?
No, I'm fine.
Okay, I'm really happy that you contribute something to our discussion, and I'm not the sole speaker, but you can also say something. And now let us move to another section, and we will speak about the temple decorations. And this is an interesting topic. And I remember somebody of you when you in the first hour when we were speaking, somebody of you has mentioned already something about the decoration of the temple. So what you can say about the decoration? Can you repeat it again? So temple's decoration, so they were lavishly decorated, and what kind of decoration did they use? I don't remember who was speaking about that, but I remember that somebody was saying something about decoration.
It was me.
Okay.
Yeah. Where we did indicate that I think it was on the similarities. If I can remember very well.
It seems to me it was the differences.
The different. Oh yes. On the differences, where it was on point. Let me check the point. Okay. Yes, where I was saying the fact that they assumed that the deities occupied these places and as places of honor. So to make sure that even the atmosphere itself, the environment was representing a deity who was honored as a patron or a protector, they had to adorn the places to be equivalent to the understanding of the exaltedness of that deity. That is what I found when I was going through.
Yeah, it's true. And do you see, if it is a deity place, so the temple should be very well decorated, and it should be decorated with gold, with some other things. So because it is a deity, so his chamber should be on the level of should represent the deity. Even remember what David said, that I live in the house, yeah, and the ark of the Lord is in the tent. And for him, it was it was unfair, because do you see, he's dwelling in the house, and it looks like the ark of the Lord, or Lord's dwelling, is just in the tent. So he wanted to make it equal to his house, so that God will dwell. And do you see, again, we have the same idea, the dwelling of a deity. So tabernacle is a place. Yes.
Yeah, still there on the decoration, besides the idea that it needed to look like the house or the dwelling of a deity. What I find interesting, and maybe it's a difference from the temple of God of Israel, it's how they decorated it. Because if you go to the Egyptian temples, you'd have the images of the gods themselves. Okay, you'd have the images of the gods themselves, and then there's one temple I think that's by Handley. Handley talks about of one of the temples where there was a relief where the king was offering gifts to the deity. So those were the kind of drawings that they would be putting there, which you don't really find that in the Israelite temple. The decoration there, although it was with these colors, we have maybe images of cherubims and all of that, but not of the deity itself. So the deity is not pictured in the Israelite.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it's true. And now we just will see just elements of the decoration of the temple. And you are right that very often what they did, they portrayed the deity itself, himself. Yeah. So this is a relief from the Ninurta temple of Ashurnasirpal II. And here, of course, it's very difficult to understand what is described here, but it looks like this man at the right side. This is a portrait of a deity. And of course, the deity was anthropomorphic. So it was portrayed as a man. And the deity, Ninurta himself, because it was a Ninurta temple, is fighting with this winged creature. So it looks like it was a demon or something else, but the deity is fighting with it, with this demon or the bird, or it's difficult to say, some mythical creature. And this one of the common scenes that we can find on the walls of the temple, of the ancient temples. So they usually portrayed deities and some mythological scenes from the life of the deity. Okay. Yeah, by the way, I just compared to the Orthodox temples. I know that most of you are not from the Orthodox culture, but in the Orthodox temple, they also have the same. All the walls of the temples are decorated by some pictures of from the Bible, some stories from the Bible, and so on and so forth. Yeah. Or another very common issue. Yes, Pastor Mayboy. Pastor Mayboy, please go ahead.
Yes, Professor, I'm just trying to think within myself, but thinking aloud. What was making these ancients to make reliefs of God in form of human forms? Is it the philosophy of trying to interpret Genesis story of God saying, let us make man in our image? And then now they are reduplicating that to say, if since God make us in his image, then we can also make him to be in our image. Now, since humanity is male and female, and they are also now thinking the divine is also, is this the philosophy? I'm just trying to wonder what made this really to be so fashionable.
But do you see, it was a common idea in ancient Near East. So deity was always portrayed as in anthropomorphic form. And even, let me go back to this Atrahasis epos. And this story even maybe more than any other relief demonstrates how they understood deities. So just remember the Greek mythology, Greek mythology, and how their gods were very, very similar to the people. So they have the same like patience, they have the same vices. So they were like people. They were quarreling with each other. They were trying to, they trying to exalt themselves above others. They tried to make some tricks with other gods, intrigues, so made a lot of intrigues. So we can see that they behaved exactly like people were behaving. In the epos of Atrahasis, there is also very interesting, like the beginning of the story is like that God created gods. So there was a supreme God who created lesser gods. And the task of the lesser gods was just to dig canals, because this is Mesopotamia, and in Mesopotamia, the canals are very important for for gardening, for everything related to agriculture. And the gods were very much tired of this work of digging canals. So what they did, they decided to make a man. And now people were digging the channels and the gods were resting. And after that, when the people started to multiply, they became noisy, and that is why the flood happened. But what I want to say that do you see they always try to portray gods very similar to people, and it was a common issue almost everywhere. Okay, but I don't think that it was a desire to do something on this statement in the book of Genesis, that God created man according to his image and according to his likeness. So I don't think this idea was prevalent in ancient Near East thought. Most probably vice versa. They created gods in their own image and in their own likeness. Yeah. Okay, I don't know. Did I answer a question?
Yeah, yes.
Okay, so let's see another. This is already Egyptian temple, and we can see something similar scene when the goddess is nursing the king, the pharaoh, and it was also like a common scene or common picture in the ancient temples. And we can see that it is just a very, very common motif to describe some scenes of the life of the deities or interaction between deity and man. So this is one of the issues in the decoration of the temple. And I just want to move to another, I believe, quite important issue, and it is very much related to the Bible. One more motif in decoration is decoration at the walls of the temple with the ornament that reminds plants and vegetation. For example, if it was a pillar in the temple, they might be decorated as the palm tree, as a fig tree, palm tree, or date tree, or fig tree, no, not fig tree, date tree. And we can find some other images of plants and vegetation in the temples. For example, the palm image can be also associated with the tree of life. The ancient text, CT 16, has a depiction of the so-called kiskano, which is sometimes translated as a palm tree, but resembles very much the tree of life. And this is the text. In Eridu, this kiskano, and most probably it is a palm tree, grew overshadowing. In a holy place, did it become green. Its root was of white crystal, which stretched towards the deep. Before Air, this is the name of the god, was its course in Eridu, teeming with fertility. Its seat was the central place of the earth. Its foliage was the couch of Zikum, and the primeval mother. Into the heart of its holy house, which spread its shade like a forest, has no man entered. There is the home of the mighty mother who passes across the sky. Of course, it's kind of a poetry and it's very difficult to understand, but it describes this kiskano, and sometimes it is translated as a palm tree, but maybe it is even more than the palm tree. But this is idea of something very similar to the tree of life, that existed even before gods existed, or they came to this place, and which gives the shadow to everything. And it was like a forest where nobody has entered. So we can see this idea of the tree of life as one of the ideas that we can find in the ancient Near East temple decorations. And it is not only the tree of life, but we can see some other elements of the nature in the decoration of the temples. And now it's very important to make one more parallel between gardens and temples. And we can find also many parallels here, that temples sometimes were associated with gardens. Therefore, the presence of trees in the temples, either artificial or real, was closely related to the concept of paradise. The paradise-type scenes were very common both in the royal palaces and the temples. And what I want to say, it seems to me I mentioned yesterday, and I just want to repeat it today. Do you remember those, the hanging gardens of Semiramid, or how they, don't know how they called them, that are supposed to be, people believe that they were in Babylon, so most probably it was not true. So there was no hanging gardens in Babylon, but we can see that there were many gardens in Assyrian palaces and temples. And really many of the Assyrian rulers liked to make many gardens, both in the temples and in their royal palaces. For example, the inscription of Tiglath-Pileser I says, "I took cedar, box tree, and Kenish oak from the lands of which I had gained dominion, such trees which none among the previous kings my forefathers had ever planted, and I planted them in the orchards of my land. I took rare orchard fruit, which is not found in my land, and filled the orchards of Assyria." So do you see, Tiglath-Pileser is here is described as the one who bring trees from different lands that he conquered, and he brought all those trees to his palace or to his royal garden. And it looks like Assyrians had special love to gardens and to trees. The fallen kings planted a lot of gardens in their capital cities. The most famous among them is the garden palace of Sargon in Dur-Saruken and Sennacherib in Nineveh. The survived letters of Sargon's correspondents say that he collected several thousand plants from all parts of his empire. Around it means city, I constructed a park, an exact replica of the Amanus Mountains, in which all the aromatic plants of the Hatti land and the fruit trees of every mountain are planted. In other words, the kings wanted to live in a kind of a paradise environment. And this is the picture of the garden of Sargon II. And we can see that really they like to make all those gardens in their place of living. And it was not only in their royal palaces, but it was also in the temples. In the temple of the New Year festival built by Sennacherib, the root pits were excavated, which indicates that the courtyard of the temple was used for planting the garden. The fruits from the temples might be used for offering to the deities. And in addition, the marriage ceremony of the king and the priestess could be performed in such temple garden. Yes, and the gardens in the ancient Near East had very strong sexual connotations, and we can find it in many documents, and even in the Bible we can find something similar. So what we can see that those kings, especially in Assyria, they really loved gardens, and they wanted to plant gardens not only in their dwelling places, in their palaces, but also in the temples. And in this case, it is very clear that the temples with those gardens, they remind somehow the paradise. Summarizing the role of the gardens in ancient Assyria, Daly says, the garden has its own symbolism and a special appeal as the recreation of paradise, the Garden of Eden. It belongs to a romantic tradition in creating by artificial means a seemingly natural landscape into which an altar or an elegant pavilion might be inserted, as in a sacred grove, a royal paradise. So it was like a common tendency, at least in Assyria, to make a temple as a kind of a paradise. And the same is true about ancient Egypt. The gardens were an essential part of their temples. For example, the Karnak temple had many gardens and was much greener than we know it today. The garden imagery in ancient Egypt was a bit different from Mesopotamia. Usually it must include the pool surrounded by flowers and trees. Such a pool, a lake, fed by natural springs and representing the primordial site of creation, was an important part of the Karnak temple. And this is the pool that is preserved until our days in the Karnak temple in Luxor, in Luxor in Egypt. And if you ever been there, so most probably it is a part of the excursion that you always are brought to that place, and the guide will tell you something about this sacred lake. So all people are usually brought there when they have a sightseeing tour in Karnak temple. And this pool or this lake, sacred lake, was an essential part of the temple complex. But even if you speak about the Karnak temple, if you go to Egypt, and Karnak temple most probably is one of the best representatives of temple, we can see that this garden imagery was very much incorporated into the temple. And as I read on the previous slide, the Karnak temple was much greener than it is today, because today it is just very dry, no trees are there. But before, it looks like even the entrance to the Karnak temple was with the trees, and those gardens and those trees were everywhere in the temple. So the approach of the Karnak temple the approaches were done as the trees avenues. As is well known, almost every pharaoh of the 18th dynasty expanded the Karnak temple. They not only built their halls and other buildings, but also planted the gardens. From different sources, it is known that Ramesses II and III planted the gardens in different parts of the temple. And of course, one also important issue is a hypostyle hall, and the hypostyle hall is made of many columns, and before those columns supported the roof, but now there is no roof, so it is like an open air tourist site. But if you look at the columns of this temple, hypostyle hall, so you can see that the columns are done in the form of the lotus flower, and some columns are done as a lotus flower that is flowering, and some when the flower is closed. So you can see. So this is again this is lotus flower, but it is not open; it is closed. but here we have the flower which is opened. So again, we have this vegetation imagery in the temple. So even the architecture of the Karnak temple resembled the garden imagery. The columns of the hypostyle hall were done in the form of the stem of papyrus, the plant that is very often associated with the sky goddess Hathor. The flower of the lotus was another important religious symbol, which is often found in different contexts. According to the myth, the sun rises out of the lotus flower. Therefore, the lotus is very often portrayed in many scenes as a symbol of vitality and eternal life. Lotus is even very often associated with the tree of life. So if in Mesopotamia, the tree of life was presented as a palm tree or date tree, in Egypt, it was a kind of a lotus plant. Okay, so we can see the same images incorporated in the architecture of the temples. What is also interesting, the funerary temples. And the funerary temples were especially famous and popular in Egypt. So we know that the pyramids actually were the funerary temples. And later on, when we speak about the 18th dynasty, we know that at that time they already didn't build the pyramids. But anyway, for each of the kings or pharaohs, they tried to build a funerary house, and those houses were very often considered to be temples. One of the most preserved funerary house or funerary temple is the temple of Hatshepsut. And usually when people go to Egypt, to Karnak temple, so they also, the guide bring them to the temple of Hatshepsut, and it's possible to go there and to see. But when we speak about the decoration of the temples and funerary temples, we can see that the vegetation also played a very, very important role in this, in the funerary temple. And very often what they did, they planted the gardens beside the tombs. And it was not practical. It was very unpractical to plant gardens beside the tombs, because usually people do not live there and it's very difficult to take care of those plants. But anyway, they did this. And you can see here on this slide the reconstruction of the trees in front of Mentuhotep's funerary temple. And the temple itself is very similar to the temple of Hatshepsut. So the temple of Hatshepsut is built in a similar manner. And you can see there are a lot of trees here. So beside the temple, they planted a kind of garden. And of course, it was also like a paradise type of garden. But of course, they used different trees. They used tamarisk and sycamore fig tree. But the idea, of course, was the same behind those gardens. So they believed that especially the pharaohs, they will go to the netherworld and they became deities. They live in the paradise. So they wanted to make a kind of paradise just beside the funerary temples. Okay, any questions about that, or what kind of conclusion can we make based on this, these issues? That they wanted to make a temple as a garden. They wanted to make a temple as a garden. Any questions?
Well, I don't.
I have come across books that try to describe the Garden of Eden as a temple or sanctuary. Is this something related to, or how does this relate to what we are learning here?
Okay, so I understood you don't have questions, but I want to ask you a question. And my question is quite simple. I just want to ask you, so what does it tell us? And I just want us to incorporate everything together, what we studied yesterday and today about the temples in ancient Near East. And do you remember that we started with the first sacred places? And do you remember what those sacred places or places of worship were? We spoke about the open
air places,
air places.
shrines, or
So in the beginning, it looks like they worshipped on the nature. And you remember I said that even according to the Bible, first people didn't build the temples.
yes,
First people didn't build the temples, but they worshipped just on nature. Just built altars and worship gods or deities on nature, even according to the Bible. Yeah, and it looks like the ancient people, the same concept that the worship should not be in the building. So the building is a kind of an artificial issue, but the main worship must be on the nature. And maybe because of that, they transferred those ideas into the decoration of their temple. So the decoration must resemble this a kind of a paradise, so the worship in paradise. And it will be very much related, what we said right now, it will be very much related to the next topic. And our next topic is Eden as a sanctuary. Eden as a sanctuary, the first sanctuary that is mentioned of the Bible. But of course, we will speak about it later. Okay, any other questions or anything you would like to say or would like to add?
yeah, Prof.
Yes,
I
please.
think from my end, when I look at that, I don't know, but I think these people were somehow influenced by the stories sisters about Eden, about what happened, and they had this yearning of going back there, and so they had this association of God with the garden and all of that. That's how somehow I can explain that.
Thank you. I agree with you. I very much agree with you. Okay, anything else? Okay, if you don't have questions, so we have almost 12 now in Kenya. So I suggest let us make a 10 minutes break and we will continue. Okay, if you don't mind.
That's fine.
So 10 minutes break. So we spoke about the decoration of the temple, and there is one more very interesting part that I would like to discuss with you, and this is about commandments to build the temple. Who built the temple? Who is responsible for building the temples? And we can find some very interesting parallels with the story written in the Bible. So written records about the temple construction. And there are plenty of them. And of course, we don't have time to discuss all of them, but at least we can discuss one of the most famous. And one of the most famous story about that was recorded about the construction of the temple is the story that was preserved on the so-called Gudea cylinders. Excuse me. And just a minute. And as I said, there are many different accounts, but this account has many parallels with the biblical account about the construction of the tabernacle. So who was this Gudea? Gudea was a king of Lagash in southern Mesopotamia, and he lived in the 3rd millennium, in the end of the 3rd millennium BC, before Christ. But of course, the years of his rule is not very clear because there are different chronological systems. But anyway, he lived in 3rd millennium BC, and it looks like when he ruled, during his rule, there was a kind of a golden age for the city, and we know that he built a temple for the deity. And these cylinders told us that one day the deity named Ningirsu appeared in a dream to Gudea and commanded him to build a temple, a Nino. And Gudea didn't understand the dream and went to the goddess Nanshe for interpretation. And Nanshe explained the meaning of the dream and instructed Gudea on what to do to get additional information about the temple. Gudea strictly followed all the instructions and got another dream. Ningirsu again appeared to Gudea and promised to bless him in case the temple is built. So he got this dream, and in the dream he got a commandment to build a temple. After that, Gudea started preparation for the construction. He did not only collect all the needed materials, some of them he brought from distant lands, but also purified the city and tried to introduce social equality. When the preparation was over, he was given another dream, and the plan of the building was revealed to him. So he got even the plan. And of course, it's very, very similar to what we have in the book of Exodus, when Moses was given the so-called Tavnit, and Tavnit is also a kind of a plan. After the temple was erected, Gudea dedicated it. He brought sacrifices and in prayer asked for God's assistance in bringing Ningirsu into a new house. By the way, at that time, there was a kind of, it was a kind of a ritual when, for example, a new temple is built for a deity, so the deity must move from one house, the old one, to a new one. And it was a ritual from moving from one house to another house. The deity was supposed to move from the old Eninu to a new one. And Gudea himself went to the old temple to invite Ningirsu and his consort Bao to a new house. The god's entry into a new house is the climax of the account. After that, Gudea assigned the staff personnel for the new temple, and the deities and the people of Lagash celebrated this event for 7 days. And finally, we can see that Ningirsu, this deity, blessed Gudea. And of course, when we read the story, we can find a lot of parallels. And there are a lot of parallels with the building of the tabernacle and also the building of the temple. There are many parallels we can find here. Like in the building of the temple, we can see that David and Solomon first prepared all the materials for the building, and only after that they started the construction process. So we see something similar here. And the idea of blessing is also common in both narratives, because we know that Solomon blessed people, and he prayed for the blessing, his famous prayer, and finally he blessed people. And the same we can see here. The idea of blessing is present in this narrative. So there are many parallels. And of course, when we speak about that, the liberal scholars, they must probably say that because of these parallels and because this account is very old, is very ancient, so we know that it is dated to the 3rd millennium BC, and the story of Moses, at least like 500 years or even more younger than this story. So most probably the liberal scholars will say that actually Moses or somebody else just borrowed this material from ancient Near East stories. And we have not only this story, but we have some other stories. There are many similar accounts of the construction of the sacred buildings. Such kings as Tiglath-Pileser I, Sargon II, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, Ashurbanipal, Nabopolassar, Nebuchadnezzar, and others left some documents relating to their building activities. And the most common elements shared by most of them are deity's command or permission to build the temple. There are different ways how it might be obtained, direct command, divination, or dream, or something else. Preparation for the construction process, collecting materials, molding bricks, foundation of the temple. Very often the king participated in the ceremony of laying the first brick. It was a special ceremony of laying the first brick of the temple. The description of the building process, usually in a poetic form, dedication of the temple, transferring deities to a new or restored building, festivity, blessings for those who will venerate the temple, and curses for those who will demolish it. So these are the most common elements of those stories that we can find in the ancient Near East about the construction process. And of course, we can find a lot of parallels with the Bible and with the construction of the temple and construction of the tabernacle. So Victor Horowitz compared more than 20 extra biblical accounts of the temple construction and 4 biblical accounts, and came to the conclusion that there are plenty of similarities among them, so that it is possible to say that all of them are typical, routine ancient Near East building stories. Okay, now we need to come to a kind of a conclusion of our lecture today. And do you have any questions or anything you would like to ask or you would like to add to that?
I have something to say, Prof.
Yes, please.
What is interesting in this lecture on the similarities, both from the environmental and from the architectural and from the instructions, one thing is popping up in my mind, that this is a clear indication that humanity had a source and a common ground from the beginning.
Okay, good.
And yet, because of time differences and geography, the modification of these ideas began to come in, because generally I have seen a lot of similarities. Even when I was researching, I saw more similarities than differences.
Okay, good.
So that's basically what is dawning on my mind.
Mm-hmm.
That it's purely just a matter of geography and where they stayed at the end of the day. The story seems to be, there should be some original story, either of the creation, of the paradise. We saw it in miniatures in different places. We come to the temple structure, we come to worship. There's a lot of strings that seem to come closer to each other, but what is different again is typical. It's clear that the differences again are quite significant, that you can differentiate to say, okay, within this mess of so many things, this aspect for the Jewish one is outstanding.
Thank you very much. Actually, you articulated the conclusion that I would like to do in the end of this lecture. So it's true that we have so many similarities between ancient Near East ideas and the biblical presentation of the same ideas. And of course, we have two ways how we can explain it. And usually when we speak about liberal theologians, so liberal theologians will explain it like I told you. They will tell that most probably biblical authors, because they wrote later on, they borrowed those ideas from ancient Near East literature or ancient Near East traditional customs. But we have another way how we can explain it. And we can say that most probably there was one root or one original story or one original tradition of worship or one original understanding of the temple and sacred place. And when the time elapsed, this understanding, because of human corruption, this understanding was twisted, was corrupted as well. And that is why many differences appeared in many different religions. So the understanding of God, the understanding of deity, the understanding of how to worship, those differences appeared on the way. But the original source was the same. And because of this same original source, we might have so many differences in Israelite religion, which we believe was the closest to the original source compared to all other religions. Okay, yeah, thank you. Maybe somebody wants to say to add something more to this issue.
Yes, Prof. I subscribe to that, what you're saying now, for the original main take of it and corruption later on of the original story. But then could it also, because Israel lived among these people, and these people had a certain way of communication between us and them, like God would come and tell them to build, give them a plan and all of that, be that communicated with Israel in a way that was somehow normal for deities to communicate with their people as well. To say that even though they may have not stories and the corruption and all of that, but if people around, the God came, told us, gave us the plan and all of that, and that's how they perceived God to communicate them, the temple. Maybe God also used the similar way to communicate as well his temple to his people. A dangerous way of thinking, but I believe God communicates to us in a way that we can understand.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I understand what you want to say. Yes, it's true that very often God speaks to the people on the language that they can understand. And later on, I believe when we continue studying this topic about the sanctuary, we will see how even God accommodate people's fragility or people's, people's shortcomings, so that he meets some people's needs when he established some standards of the religion. So we will see it a little bit later. Yeah, but I agree with you that God can use the same media of communication that other people had. But of course, not. We cannot say that God accepts everything. Like, for example, divination.
Yes.
If it was like normal for other religion, but it was not normal for Israel. But sometimes he uses some similar issues. Yes, thank you very much. And I saw that somebody also raised up a hand, and you can speak.
Yes, Professor. What I want to explain about similarities, every people have a culture. When God is going to talk to a people, he will talk within the culture. So some similarities, God is talking to Israelite according to the culture of ancient Near East. And we can see that in those similarities, the ancient, they have something who oppose
Yes.
the thing what God recommended to Israelite. So I wanted to underline that every people have a culture. If God want to talk to them, we will use also this culture to talk with them. So we can see the similarities among between ancient nearest people and also Israelites. Thank you.
Okay, okay. So yes, I can agree with you to some extent, but sometimes we can see, but I don't want to go to this direction, but sometimes it is possible that the culture is against to what God is saying. And I just want to give you 2 examples, and both examples from the life of Abraham. So now we have a lot of documents to understand the culture of the time. And for example, when Sarah told him, take Hagar and enter to her tent and let her deliver or bear a child for me. So it was very well according to the culture. It was very well according to the culture, but it was against what God was saying. Or another story, again, Hagar said, expel this, Sarah said, expel this servant girl, Hagar, and I don't want she live with us, so just expel her from our house. So it was against the culture, because according to the culture of that time, if a man got a concubine and the concubine bore children to him, he shouldn't expel her. He could treat her as a slave girl, it's true, but he couldn't expel her. So it was against the culture. But do you remember what God said? So just follow what your wife told you to do. So do you see, sometimes culture is against, and in some cases it is against what God is saying, what God is speaking. But I agree with you that God accommodates our culture so that he speaks in such a way that we can understand it. Okay, I saw somebody else was also raising a hand. Oh no.
Maybe I can ask a question.
Yes, please, you can ask a question.
Yes, maybe related to a question you had asked before. In the Bible, in the times of before Moses, we had this worship where, like for example, in the case of Abraham, he would go and offer sacrifice in an altar that he has built himself. But with the introduction of the tabernacle, there's the introduction of the office of a priest. So something, a new aspect is coming in with the introduction of the tabernacle. So the question is, how can is this a new revelation that is coming in?
In the time of Moses?
Yes.
Compared to what we have in the time of patriarchs?
Yes.
Okay, is a topic that we will discuss. So our next topic is Eden, Garden of Eden as a temple, and after that we will discuss the topic about the practice of worship of the patriarchs, and we will discuss it. But thank you for the question. It's a very good question, and we need to answer it. Okay, but we will come to it. It's very important. Okay, anything else? So if you don't have questions, I just want to discuss with you some other issues. So we already made a conclusion here. And I just want to open the course outline. Just want to ask you a question. So did you enjoy the reading of those material that you found and such kind of method when when the teacher is not the only one who is speaking, but you can also speak and you can also contribute something to the class?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so if you really like it, so let us do the same. Let us continue the same for the next lectures. And first of all, let us discuss when we are supposed to have the next lecture, because we already did 3 lectures, as we said, during this week. And when would you like to have the next one? So we might have one session next week. Is it okay with you? Or we can postpone everything up to June 13, up to June 13. So what would be the pleasure of the house?
I suggest we can do a few things next week prior to the GC.
Okay. Okay. So in this case, can we assign the next our meeting on Monday? Monday, it will be May 30. Would it be okay with you?
It's okay with me.
It's okay with me. Even tomorrow is okay.
No, for this week we said the 3 assignments. I mean, three slots, isn't it?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
If you don't mind, we can have tomorrow as well. But if you have some other reservations or some other issues, so we can just have next week, like for example, at least one next week.
Professor, to me, I think that it will be better to do it next week on Monday.
Okay, so in this case, it's we agreed that we will have one more lecture next week on Monday.
Monday morning.
Monday morning, yes.
That's fine.
That's fine.
Okay, good. So if it is fine for all of you, so we will continue like that. So next lecture is on Monday. Now, I also would like you to read as much as possible about the Eden, Garden of Eden as a sanctuary. And I would like you to do the following. Please find arguments that scholars use for Garden of Eden as a sanctuary. And some scholars, of course, they're not many. There are only a few of them. But anyway, there are some scholars who say that the Garden of Eden was not a sanctuary, And they also try to put forward their arguments why they believe it is not a sanctuary. So please try to find both arguments for the sanctuary and against the sanctuary. And we, of course, we will discuss everything together. And again, I don't want to tell you that to go to this piece of literature or to another piece of literature. I just want you to look for yourself, and I want you to find some sources and to bring them in the class, and we will discuss it together. So is it okay? Is it clear?
Yes, clear.
Okay. Okay, and one more issue that I would like you to ask. Let us set up a deadline for the first reflection paper. Okay, what would you like to make a deadline for it? I understand that the GC session is a kind of interruption on the one hand, but on another hand, especially for those of us who do not go to the GC session, it will be time that we can just use it for writing for. And I just want to tell you, I don't want you to write like a very long paper. Just 5 pages would be enough. But I just want to see your thoughts, how you are thinking, what kind of arguments you can bring, how you work with the other literature, and etc. So I will pay attention to those issues. Okay, I'm just waiting for the suggestion from you. Okay, if you don't want to
Prof,
suggest.
if you could repeat, I missed the.
Okay, so I am asking, I don't want to postpone everything till the very end of the assignments. So that is why I would like you to do assignments on the way. And one of the assignments is to write a reflection paper. And as I said, reflection paper must not be something very like long. It must be just something like about 5 pages long, 5, 6, not more than 6 pages. But I just want to see how you are thinking, what kind of arguments can you bring, how you interact with other literature. Those issues are important. So I believe you can do it in one day. But I just want to discuss with you the deadline for this assignment. So we have 2 reflection papers, and I don't want to postpone everything till the very end. So let us do something on the way. So what would be the deadline for the first reflection paper?
Tuesday.
June 18th.
Yes, Pastor Mititi, what would you suggest?
June 18th.
June, what date?
18th. That is, sorry, that's a Saturday. Let's put it on 17th.
Friday. Maybe we can do it closer, I mean, faster.
Okay.
Like 16.
All right.
Okay. Any other suggestions?
Since that will be after GC, that will be after GC, isn't it?
Yes, it will be after the GC.
That to 16 will be okay.
Okay. So let us come to this conclusion now. So the first reflection paper due is June 16. This is Thursday. Okay.
Stay with me.
Okay. So everybody is agreed upon that.
Yes.
And the first reflection paper would be about the Divine Council and the Heavenly Temple. You can write on this issue. Okay.
Yes.
So it looks like we discussed everything. Do you have anything else to discuss or anything else to say? You can do this, and the reflection paper must be submitted via Moodle, and it will be checked with the plagiarism. Okay. So I just want you to learn how to write without plagiarizing, without copying and paste, but express your own ideas. So that is why I don't want it to be a long paper. I want it to be just a short one, but it is supposed to be your paper with the footnotes, with everything as it is required. If you have any questions, we can also discuss it on Monday about that. And if you have any issues with the installing the Safe Exam browser, we can also discuss it on Monday, but it will be too late already because we set a deadline. Yes, Sunday. So in case if you have some issues or problems with the installing the Safe Exam browser, please contact our IT people. So that is why I would like to ask you, please try to do it as soon as possible because the deadline is Sunday. So please do it before Sunday. So if you have any questions or any problems, they can help you out.
Okay.
Okay, if you don't have questions and everything is clear, Pastor Mayboy, can you
Yes.
tell me, so can you, if the next meeting is next Monday, who will be responsible for the devotion on Monday?
The program on Monday, I will take it.
Okay,
Let me just show it here so that others can also see. Are we seeing it?
yes,
So the Monday one, which is, we said Monday to be 20 what? Sunday is 29, so that is 30th, isn't it?
yes, May 30th.
That is 30th. So that one, I will take it. Then the next one will be followed by Pastor Mulumba. When we determine the next session, Pastor Mulumba will follow. And then the other one will be followed by Jacob, Huma, Obed, Silas, Orangi, and Iokia, and lastly, Bundi.
Okay, very well. So I believe everybody is happy with this schedule.
We're fine.
Okay.
It's okay.
Okay, good. So now we have schedule and we know, and I believe Pastor Muchaba will remind people when their turn is approaching.
Sure.
Okay, any questions so far? Pastor Fidelis, how are you? How's your health?
Yeah, Prof, I've improved. I was in the hospital in the morning. Gave me some drugs, only that I'm feeling drowsy, but I'm coming up well. I hope by tomorrow or later day I'll be okay.
Praise God. Praise God for that.
Thank you. Thank you for the prayers and the concern.
Okay, so now let us pray in the end, and may I ask somebody as a volunteer to pray at the end of our session.
Okay, let us pray. Our gracious and our loving Father, we want to thank you this time for the wonderful ways in which you have dealt with us. We want to thank you. You've given us to study, to understand the issues about temple and worship in the ancient Near East. Father, we pray that everything that we read and we study will help us to understand you more. Most importantly, to strengthen our relationship with you. At this moment, as we are leaving this place and this class, we want to pray, Father, that you continue to be with us, that you give us the wisdom and knowledge that we need. We want to pray, Father, in a special way for who has lost his nephew. We pray, Father, that you will console the family and that you will take care of all the proceedings that they are going with the preparation of the burial. Father, that at this time of sorrow, they will feel the presence of the Spirit in their lives. We pray all of this in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Okay, thank you very much for the prayer, and thank you very much for being in this class. So see you on Monday. If you have any questions or concerns, please contact me via email or WhatsApp.
Thank you.
Okay. All the best and God bless you.